Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined on, for us, kind of an exciting day by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project.
Hi. Exciting is
maybe a strong word, but, energetic. Energizing.
Yeah, okay. Energizing. I think exciting's fine.
Yeah, we can admit we get excited by these things. I think that's good.
This is good. I like this. This is building tension.
Right.
Excitement in the audience.
So, as you might imagine, we have some new polling data. Our listeners know what actually excites us, I think. So we have some new polling data from a new University of Texas Politics Project poll that sheds some light and maybe, some shadows on the dominant story right now in Texas politics, which is, of course, the impeachment trial of suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton, which is set to begin in the Texas Senate on September 5th, right after Labor Day. The data was collected from August 18th to the 29th, so it's very fresh, essentially from last week. We're recording on Thursday, and you should be hearing this at the earliest on Friday. We've excerpted the Paxton data from that poll for early release, given that the trial is coming up after the long weekend. And so, parenthetically, keep an eye out next week for the rest of the data. We did do our usual complete poll, 15-minute poll, which has a lot of very interesting kind of zeitgeisty results. At least that's how it was written.
Zeitgeisty. Yes.
Yeah, how we were thinking about it at the time, in addition to, usual issues of the moment and at our trend data, et cetera. So for today, with the Paxton trial looming large, let's dive right into it. Let's just start by looking at the top lines on the main questions that we've released relating to Ken Paxton. So why don't you start us out on that, Josh?
Yeah, let's dispense with the foreplay. Let's go straight to the question. Do you think that Ken Paxton took actions while Attorney General that justify removing him from office? So from our sample of registered voters, what we found was 47% said yes, Ken Paxton has taken actions while Attorney General that justify removing him from office. 18% said no. 35% said don't know, no opinion. So, a strong plurality saying yes, with a significant portion, about a little more than a third of the electorate saying, at this point, they don't know. They're not sure.
Right.
Should we jump into the partisans, or do you want to just stick with the top
let's go back to the partisans. I mean, jump into the partisans as long as we're here. We'll come back and do something with it.
I think we need to just to unpack that number a little more anyway.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So it's unsurprising to find, most Democrats, 71% say yes, Ken Paxton, has done things that justify removing from office. Only 8% say no. Only about 1 in 5 don't have an opinion on that. Among Republicans, what you find is, a big split. And this is going to be a pretty consistent pattern here. 43%, the plurality, had no opinion yet. They're not sure whether he's done anything as Attorney General that justify removing him from office. But nearly a quarter, 24% say yes, he has and should be removed. 32%, about a third, say no, he hasn't. So it's pretty even. Among independents, the numbers are a little bit more lopsided against Ken Paxton, though, again, with a large share of the plurality, 44%, saying they don't have an opinion. But 42% say that he should be removed from office, with only 14% saying that he shouldn't.
And this is probably, we do this all the time where we provide the methodological note that, our mode of approaching this, those independents are what we call true independents. So we have taken people that respondents who initially identify as independent, but then on a follow-up say that they lean towards one of the parties, and we have folded the leaners into the partisans. And looking at, we don't have to crawl down this rabbit hole right now, but in looking at some of the 7-point numbers, this is another one of those cases where if somebody asks us why we do that, I would show them this data.
Yeah, exactly.
All I mean by that is the independents that say that they lean one way or the other look more like the strong partisans than they do the weak partisans, let alone the true independents.
Yeah, and there's a whole long discussion and engagement going about on in the universe of political science elsewhere about whether you should do that or not. But from the standpoint of just studying public opinion, what Jim said, I think, is the operative point at this point. Anyway, moving on. We repeated a question that we asked back in June, whether or not the Texas House was justified in impeaching Attorney General Ken Paxton. And interestingly here, what we found was from June to August, despite all the attention, all the coverage, the document dump, everything else, these numbers did not move. 50% of Texas voters in June said that the House was justified in impeaching Ken Paxton. In August, 50% say that they are justified. In fact, the numbers are exactly the same. 17% say they were not justified in both polls, and 33% a third don't know. So those numbers have sat, and we'll come back to that, but it's sort of interesting in and of itself. And then the other sort of big top line, number is Paxton approval. And this is maybe, one of the, spicier results in some ways. Right now, we'll get into some of the details of this. Overall, Paxton's job approval right now sits at 27% approve, 46% disapprove for a net of negative 19. Now, among Democrats, not surprisingly, 69% disapprove, 12% approve. But among Republicans, we see 46% approving to 23% disapproving, which is, doesn't sound terrible on its face, but when you start to look into the trend data and what we've seen in the past, it's not a good look.
Right, both trend and intensity. Only 21% of those Republicans say that they approve strongly. That about a fifth of Republicans is an interesting kind of marker in a couple of different ways.
Right.
So some takeaways from the results. What do we make of this? I mean, I think as Josh said in talking about some of the numbers he just shared with you, despite the preoccupation with this, unambiguously big historical moment among people that are in or near the process or, probably listen to this podcast.
For sure.
Political junkies, if you want to use that term, our indicators of attention to the matter remained really very static. So we may have spent our summer, and by we, it's the collective we. Yeah. Josh and I and all of you out there.
Yeah, our friends.
We may have spent our summer thinking about this and anticipating the trial and parsing it, around the pool, over beers, over meals. But it hasn't gained in salience to most Texans.
Yeah, and this is something that, I think, I hate when this happens, but I also somewhat hardened by it, and that's probably reasonable. We think about the time frame we're talking about here. We're talking about from June to August. We're talking about the dog days of summer. We're talking about a time when, most people, we know if we were talking about anything else, we would say, well, this is when people aren't paying attention. I mean, in some ways, I think maybe early on when this began, I don't know if we talked about, the potential timing of the trial before it was set during the podcast, but there was, I was having some thoughts at the time about, well, if they really wanted to just kind of bury this thing, do it in July.
Right.
And by bury, I don't mean you're able to bury it, but, limit the amount of attention that would be brought to this. That would be kind of when you would do this.
Yeah.
Now, it's kind of interesting. It speaks to the fact that, in some ways you'd say, okay, yes, people haven't been paying attention to it, but now actually that the kids are back to school, people are getting back into kind of fall routines, the temperature is coming down, the actual temperature, not the political temperature. It'll be interesting to see what happens as attention turns, I would say, as the political space in Texas is so universally focused on this one thing. And that's the other thing too. There were other things competing this summer. They're still competing, having to do with the border.
Yeah, but both at the state level and certainly at the national level. The Trump, it's been a very active summer for former President Trump and his legal travails.
Put another way, this is one story among many for voters to choose to ignore.
Right, and the baseline on this is a lot, it was a lot lower, in terms of just what we think of when we think about people's general knowledge and awareness of any attorney general, not just this one.
That's right. And that's the thing I think it's important too, is when we're talking about statewide elected officials and their profiles, the attorney general's a little bit down the list. He's not the governor. His numbers have historically looked closer to that of the lieutenant governors, and since there's a larger share of people who don't hold an opinion about him. And so what we found, just to put the actual numbers out there, because I don't think we've actually covered them yet, only 31% of voters say that they've heard a lot about Ken Paxton's legal problems, which was the same as in June. And the share who say that they've heard a lot about the trial, the impeachment and the upcoming trial is a little bit less than that, which is also kind of what we would expect at this point, given the trial hasn't actually started in earnest.
And it's more specific. It's more specific
as opposed to all the possible things you might have heard about his legal problems. But the point remains, there's about a third of Texans who've been paying a lot of attention to this, or maintaining that level of attention. And, again, just, say, we'll see what happens over the course of the trial, whether that number ticks up or not. I think there's reason to suspect it will, both because of, the duration of the trial and probably the intensity of coverage, but and also the fact that it's not summer. At the same time, there are a lot of other stories out there that are competing for attention, and, we'll see. This is pretty,
There are a lot of people in court right now.
So
given that is, given these top lines, given what we've talked about this generally, it seemed like, we should talk about the upsides and downsides of this data for the two sides in the trial and for the Attorney General himself. So what do you think? Like, let's start with, some indications that there's, if you're an ally of Attorney General Paxton or your Attorney General Paxton, you can see some upsides here, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if
they're not huge, but they're there.
No, I mean, look, if you look at the mainstream media coverage that has taken place over the course of the summer, which is sort of I think not litigated, it's not the right word at this point, but sort of rehashed a lot of the allegations against Paxton, both, related specifically to the impeachment, but sort of, over the course of his entirety in office.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is it's not as much, this is just picking words.
No, it's fine.
I think that it's not even so much, it's been a rehash, but it's because there has been a lot of revelation of the particulars, and that's part of the evidence gathering and disclosure process.
I think I have a very unique view on this, which is sort of as someone who follows all this stuff almost so closely that it could be considered a problem. It's sort of like, okay, if you've been following it as closely as I have, or we have, or whatever, or some of you have. It's sort of like there were these revelations, months and months and months, if not years ago, and then to the extent that more detail have come out that have confirmed those revelations, to me, it doesn't feel new, but I think the reality is it doesn't change the fact that when you put, meat on the bones, it does make it more real. And I think that's the thing.
Well, and I think the mechanism of that is important, right? Because what's happened is, we've had this back and forth, a lot of motions, and, that spread out through June, July, August, when, regular people weren't paying attention. But we've seen the release of, a lot of motions, volumes of evidence.
Right.
And then numerous news stories that have come out as reporters dig through all that evidence, right? And I think those mechanisms are kind of interesting and important, to think about. All that is going on, and, there's been some very good reporting. And as we discussed last week, some of those motions for people like us were very interesting, sophisticated, everything from the nitty-gritty, sometimes kind of grimy details to large, sort of big consequential constitutional systemic arguments.
Right.
And none of that's really seemed to have landed with the public very much.
Yeah, and I think, that's a win for Paxton. I mean, I think, to the extent that if you think about, the coverage, from the last few weeks around the House manager's response to Paxton's motions that included sort of this 4,000-page, data dump that released all these new details to be covered. The fact is that doesn't seem to have moved the public dramatically, or again, given limited attention,
either moved them or drawn their attention.
Or drawn their attention. So that's definitely a win for Paxton on the political side of this. There's another result in this poll that's also, I think, a political win for Paxton, which is we asked another question we asked basically is do you think that this investigation and the impeachment is mostly based on the facts or mostly based on politics?
Question sort of we've seen a lot at the national level.
Right,
regarding former President Trump.
Right, and we may have asked similar types of questions about the president that we'll talk about next week, and the points of comparison and differences are interesting in and of themselves. But the baseline response— That's a teaser. The baseline response among Republicans, when asked this question about the impeachment trial here, is to say, on balance, it's more based on politics than based on facts. So overall, 47% of voters say it's mostly based on facts, 28% mostly based on politics. But when you look at Republicans, those numbers are basically flipped. 48% say it's mostly based on politics. 23% say it's mostly based on facts. For Democrats, 3/4 say it's mostly based on facts. Independents more say it's based on facts and based on politics. But I think we have to take this in the context of like what we already said before, which is that people aren't attending to this that much. So when I look at this, the way we set this up is I think the way that I would interpret this, which is, this is really a pretty good reflection of some of the baseline response. And I think, to the point of this is in the Paxton upside section of this discussion. This is, I think, whether this is the baseline attitudes that this is just a political squabble, whatever, or whether, the messaging that's kind of been put out about the idea that like, well, this is about a Democratic run house, or this is about, so-and-so doesn't like Ken Paxton, or so-and-so wants to be Attorney General. Whether you think those arguments are patently ridiculous and unfounded, or you believe that they make sense, the reality is that there's a baseline, I think, view in the Republican Party, especially to sort of be ready to accept this notion that this is just politics.
It's almost a reflex.
These are politicians having a political fight. So whatever.
Right, and to repeat that number, that's 48% of Republicans. With only a little less than a quarter saying, 23% saying that it was mostly based on the fact, and then the rest, roughly another quarter, saying that they don't know, haven't made up their mind, don't offer an opinion.
Right. So I think that's something that for Paxton, you'd think they're going to want to lean into that more and more, that this is, it's interesting in some ways from the, going, back and forth, how this jumps in and out of these different sort of, dimensions of things, from the side of the legal motions, they want to say this is a criminal process, not a political process. But actually, from the public side, the idea that this is some political process run amok is actually something that, probably provides them a little bit of value in their base. Right.
In the absence, I think as the starting point, it's a good one for them.
Right.
Now whether that will carry the day, but to look at this fairly through their eyes, and again, it's good to keep in mind the mechanisms, right? That the jury is the Senate. They are elected officials. Democrats are almost guaranteed to be negative vote, to be votes against Paxton in some form or another. And so you're looking at Republican public opinion here as a way of, sort of trying to figure out on both sides how senators are going to evaluate their own electoral self-interest in this.
Well, and it speaks to the message that's being thrown out there by Paxton allies, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, when they say, boy, there's a lot of Republican senators who'd like to be Attorney General.
Right.
And this is what they're speaking to when they say that.
Which also does not make it untrue.
It does not make it untrue.
we should say.
Sure.
That is not the implication there.
No.
But the implication about how it lands among voters, yes.
Right.
So there are some things for the Attorney General in these numbers that give them something to work with, or maybe, might make them feel better, but more practically give them something to work with as they think about what their strategy is. But, you can look at this glass as half empty as well. The numbers in August, they haven't changed, but they weren't really great for him to begin with, right? Most importantly, in the near terms, I was saying, among the Republican voters who are the constituents and voters of the jury of senators, Republicans as a group, and we were talking about the word to use for this, and there's more than one word, because we don't know for sure, can be seen as a group as either ambivalent or perhaps a little bit shading better for the Attorney General, maybe, are withholding judgment, right?
Right.
And so that's, on balance, I would have to say that it makes it harder for Paxton, let's put it that way, that you've got a lot of, you've got a big chunk of voters, really the majority of voters are made up of people, of Republican voters who are either leaning against you or are open to the evidence.
Yeah.
And to maybe having their mind changed as the trial starts, that's going to really be about presenting a lot of evidence.
Well, it's funny. And this is just, say this, what a shoddy social scientist I might be. You can use the same evidence to point either direction, right?
Yeah.
So the same evidence that we said, was kind of good for Paxton, the fact that there wasn't a big shift in the electorate and their attitudes due to, again, all the disclosures that came out over the last few weeks and months, that's just something that, again, they can hang their hat on and say, okay, good, we've gone through some of this. The flip side of that is, I think one of the things that I was curious about in this poll was the extent to which, many of the direct appeals, and I've talked a lot here about the information asymmetry here. Again, there are groups who are actively working, spending, on Paxton's behalf, more or less, to make the case to Republicans that basically he should not be impeached or this process is a sham. I mean, it's interesting. I drove to Houston and back over the last weekend. You see all the billboards up, talking about how this is a Democratic power grab and all these things. But there's also no indication that that's worked either, at least in the broader electorate. Now, look, I mean, I should say,
because those billboards didn't just appear.
No. And the thing is, now we're talking about the entire statewide electorate, the entire statewide pool of Republican voters. The reality is I think, as some reporting is indicating, they're definitely starting to target those appeals very specifically to specific Senate districts. However, again, this is in the glass half full for, or glass is half empty for Paxton now, half full for the House managers. At the same time, it doesn't appear as though, we didn't come back with a data and found, now 75% of Republicans say the House was unjustified in impeaching him and, he should be let off. That's not the picture we're painting. That's not the picture the public's painting. And so that definitely, I think, the House managers have also escaped this window of this sort of attempts to persuade the public before the trial happens.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to think about, your average person or, you don't even have to say your average person, a person that doesn't follow politics a lot.
Mm-hmm. Your average person.
Driving their kid between Austin and Houston for a soccer tournament or something. Sure. And they see this sign and how many people go,
what is that?
What is that? And then the other person, certain car goes, some political thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
right.
They're at it again,
Right.
It's an interesting tactic. We do see that there is support for Paxton where you would expect it to some degree, but even that is not quite as vigorous as one might think. You were looking at the numbers, looking at some of the very precise tabs in the latest poll. Among people who identify as extremely conservative, he's got a little more than half, right?
Yeah, his job approval's at 54%, 17% disapprove, 29% don't know. I mean, I think those are fine numbers, but not for Ken Paxton.
Right.
I think that's kind of the way you would look at that, right? I mean, for someone who's really based and staked his career
These are his people.
These are his people. And so I think, that's going to be a problem for him. But, again, it's not overwhelming at this point.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
No.
It's just not very good.
It's just not very good, right?
Disappointing. Right. And similar with, I think you pulled out frequent church attendees, right?
Yeah.
We have a few different measures of this.
Right. And this are people who attend church more than once a week, basically. And here we find 44% approving of his job performance, 28% disapproving, 30% don't know. Now, again, that's going to be a mix of some Democrats, some Republicans, but generally speaking, more Republicans than Democrats. And so that's, again, looking at his constituency, that's not exactly where he wants to be, but
right.
But this also fits into sort of, again, in terms of the bad news for Paxton, this fits into sort of the bigger picture of, I think, maybe some of the worst news for him in all of this, which is just his overall job approval numbers.
Right. I mean, you promised we'd come back to that, and we've kind of transitioned into that. So, even though most of the, data shows that the direct judgments about the impeachment trial, removal process, and even awareness were more or less static, there was some movement in his job approval numbers, right? And it was not in the right direction for him.
Right. So, I mean, you can pick any point in time. I mean, I think it's interesting to go back to December of 2022 because that was a high point for Paxton. He just won re-election. Statewide, his approval was 41 approved, 37 disapprove, which doesn't sound, amazing. But again, this is a competitive state in terms of the electorate. There's a lot of Democrats. There's more Republicans. Generally, we don't see anybody blowing these numbers out of the water. So if you're on the right side, you feel pretty good about it. He was +4 then.
Right.
We look to, after the impeachment in June, his approval went from 41 in December down to 30. Right. Even from April, it dropped 9 points from 39 to 30 in June. And then it dropped another 3 points in August down to 27. Looking again at his disapproval, it went from 35 in April to 41 in June to 46 in August. And, so these represent the lowest approval numbers of, basically at least our time series going back to April of 2021, the highest disapproval numbers. But most importantly, this isn't entirely a Democratic phenomena here. So what we also find is he's got his lowest approval numbers among Republicans in the time series. He's only at 46% approving. He's been as high as 73% in this poll. He was even 51 in June. He was 65 before the impeachment and for 2 surveys in both February and April among Republicans. So he's dropped almost 20 points in his approval among Republican voters. Right. And then his disapproval is up to 23 points. If we go back, again, to to February of 2023, the beginning of the year, he only had 9% disapproving. Then in April it was 13, June it's 19, August it's 23. So there is movement going on, and it's not in the right direction. The trend for Paxton is not, going in the way that he'd like it to.
Right. And then, there's something, interesting to me about that. I mean, we always talk about, we ask people these specific processes.
Yeah.
And we get these static results. But the overall, it leads one to kind of think that whether you ask somebody, are you paying attention, they say no, that, for some people, it's kind of seeping in.
It's in the ether.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I think I agree with that. I mean, I think it's in the ether. And then part of it is just, look, you may not be listening, but, you are, to some extent, I think there is like some basic catalog. And to the extent that, if you listen to Drive Time Radio or you listen to whatever, even if you're not listening closely or drawing significant conclusions or really trying to, pull out the detail, the main point is that, for the last month and a half or more, well, actually really the whole entirety of the summer, if you see Paxton's name in the news, it's attached to something negative.
Right.
And I think that's what you're kind of seeing there, even if you're not necessarily sure about the details. And look, the details are complicated. I've had lots of people who know things and follow this stuff even reasonably closely, ask me about the details and say, oh, okay. I didn't realize that that's what this is.
That's how all these things are connected. That's what they're talking about, and this is how they're all connected.
And here's the thing. Just to be fair, if I were to say, and I don't want you to answer this question, but
thank you.
But if I were to say to you, or if someone were to say to me, hey, what is this Paxton impeachment trial really about? I'd have to sit and think for a second about how what would I respond with first? What would I say is, well, the thing that's really the problem is this, or it's really that, or whatever. In some ways, what comes to my mind is actually a political response is, he went to the House and asked for $3.3 million and didn't want to tell him why.
Right.
Which does sound kind of like a political thing, but there is a lot under this that is sort of, it's complicated and it's detailed, and that's just not for most people.
Right. No, I think that's fair. Now, we're going to wind down, but we'll end on a nerdy note, a nerdy, / arguing with ourselves note.
Yeah.
It does seem to me, possibly fair that an astute listener, whether pro-Paxton, anti-Paxton, or just neutral, or just hostile towards us, or whatever,
yeah, sure.
might ask, given that he's been suspended from his job since June, isn't talking about these job approval numbers a little weird? On one sense, if the guy hasn't been in his job, his job approval numbers are going to go down. Mm-hmm. And I think that's fair. And I guess we thought about this because we tweaked the wording slightly.
Right. We basically said has done as opposed to is doing.
Right. So, on every other job approval for an incumbent, we say, how would you say Governor Abbott or whoever
is doing as governor, is doing as lieutenant governor.
Yeah. How good a job is it? Yeah. How would you rate the job he's doing as governor or whatever? So we use present tense. And in this, we tweaked. We tweaked it ever so slightly. Now I could see where people are, well,
Yeah, look, it's fair. And this is one of those things where, I'm just going to appeal to my own authority.
Please.
And what I'm going to say is, having done this for a long time, I would say, look, I think that's a valid criticism. Do I think that would account for a few points? Maybe. Because the argument is there's some Republicans out there who love Ken Paxton and say, the way that guy screwed up was getting impeached.
Right.
And I don't like that. He should be getting back to the job and doing it. Right. Now, look, do I think that accounts for the numbers we're seeing here? No, because when we look at the other numbers, right, what we find is Republicans sort of, again, mostly kind of split on this issue, right? Yeah. Which means there's lots of Republicans out there, honestly, who, think the House was justified in impeaching him, who think he's done something wrong and may, have ultimately updated their judgment. That's the much more plausible scenario that explains where most of this change has come from. I'm not saying some of it might not have come from some people who think he screwed up because he's not AG anymore.
Yeah. How could he be doing a good job if he's not in the job?
But,
smarty pants.
If I were just pulling a number out of wherever, I'd say, maybe that accounts for 4 percentage points. Maybe. Because again, that really implies a much more sophisticated read of what's going on than most of what we'd expect.
Yeah. And I think it's fair as we talk about,
that's not too dismissive.
I think, when we talk about the general sense of, again, this kind of ambient awareness because of, without a whole lot of attention, the decline over time does tell us, something about, a weakening in the sturdiness of his support.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
Because even if people are going to not give him a positive job rating because they say, well, he got kicked out of the job, but otherwise he was great. That's a lot of things. And it's still, in the end, a negative judgment.
Well, and look, I'm just going to put it this way, with another famous Republican politician who's had lots of legal problems, we see no such significant decline in assessments of him.
Yeah, and I think that's a good, as we wind it down and kind of step back, that's a good meta point here.
Yeah.
I wouldn't and can't speak for what the Attorney General or his supporters might be thinking strategically, and in terms of, looking at the national environment and thinking that the way that former President Trump has handled this in some ways is maybe a good model, and I can do that too. And there has been some indications of, delay tactics and attacking the media, calling it all politics, which does have some resonance. But I think, and we'll be able to elaborate this a little bit more, but even based on trend data to date, it's pretty clear that Ken Paxton is not Donald Trump in terms of the depth of attachment and the kind of, fierce allegiance that we see among Republicans to Donald Trump in the face of great adversity and negative context and, any number of, negative stimulation writ large, right? I think that that's one of the things that you have to kind of compare this, and that's a little bit of a teaser for next week. So you wind this up, to be a little repetitive maybe. I mean, it does seem that trying to figure out, what people are, what people might make of these numbers, there are some aspects of this that give the Attorney General something to work with. Particularly this idea that there is kind of a baseline assumption that doesn't just apply to him that he can tap into, that almost any kind of conflict you see is mostly about politics.
Yeah, political vendettas.
The process is going to be about politics, and it's not going to be about the institutional stakes that we've talked about. But that said, it does seem likely that in the near term, as the media coverage ramps up dramatically, and look, you and I both know from, talking to reporters and phone calls we're getting and experiencing this, that there is going to be a lot of coverage, and it's going to be not just in the web outlets and the newspapers and, the political journals that people like us read. It's going to be leading the local newscasts, which are, polling tells us, people pay a lot of attention to. A lot of people say they get their news from their local, they get their political news from their local newscast. And in terms of the facts that will be the focus of that coverage that are likely to come out, the airing out in a much more public way of some of the details that are in that evidence, the new witness testimony, that the news is only going to get more negative for the Attorney General, unless, of course, the charges are simply dismissed next Tuesday. There's a motion to dismiss. That is a possibility. I personally don't think
it doesn't seem
it's very likely. It doesn't seem like
it seems less likely after because my understanding was that the Senate met yesterday and could have behind closed doors dismissed some of the charges and chose not to.
Right, and one of the senators in that meeting, to my understanding, told a reporter recently that they expected, this trial could go on for 3 or 4 weeks, which is actually even longer.
I heard 4 to 6.
Or 4 to 6, actually. I think that's right, which is even long. It was longer than we had been thinking, and certainly longer than they'd been signaling. And so if that's the case, really all we're going to get is more public elaboration of the evidence and the surrounding details, for example, and if you're the Paxton people, you wouldn't like the story, and I think you'd be justified in not liking it.
Right.
But, today's AP story that's in circulation that hit again, and it's not the first time this particular story has been written, although there's a couple of new details about, the Attorney General's apparent love of perks and that he's kind of, an allegedly stingy and kind of cheap guy. He takes the cake, literally.
Well, I thought, it was interesting to say that, he's done more trips out of state than the governor and lieutenant governor combined.
Right. And that kind of, again, if you're
you don't
Paxton,
want to respond to that.
You could see why you're going to hate that story and think, oh, come on, tell me you really had to write the story per se. But there's going to be a lot of stories like that, and it's not necessarily out of bias. There already is, and there will be more churning and competition among reporters to find new information, new angles.
Yeah.
new frames for this story. And it's just very unlikely that that's going to be good for the Attorney General, for the suspended Attorney General.
And as we're wrapping up here, I think, in some ways, there's a way you can look at this point and another point we made and see how, one of, Paxton's advantages could turn into something of a disadvantage here, right? Which is, throughout this process, there've been very few people who are really defending the actions of Ken Paxton. They've been attacking the process. And that speaks to this idea that it's political. As more and more details come out that involve, witness testimony leading evening newscasts, local newscasts, saying, well, yeah, he did that. Or we're not even talking about whether he did it, but we're saying he shouldn't be impeached for it. It's like, yeah, I think that's a heavy lift at some point is again, if people do start to become more aware of, some of the fact patterns that we're talking about here, it's sort of like, because it's one of the things like, well, yeah, I mean, who cares if the Attorney General is using a burner phone?
Yeah, and to go back to
and it's kind of like, that's just not a place that I would want to be from a crisis communications standpoint, right?
Yeah, and to go back to one of our results, the only real fight against the real buttress, the foundation for that kind of argument that he didn't. This isn't really. It's just politics.
Yeah,
is to tap into that sentiment that the whole process is just about political competition and. As you say, that gets really harder to do as the facts come out.
Well, that's right. And I think, what makes that argument powerful in the moment is the absence of attention.
Right.
And people's sort of unfamiliarity with the facts. And the thing is, one thing that I know is going to happen, we are going to get a full recitation of these facts.
It's a fallback attitude. And, to end of, maybe even a slight little bit of political science, we're already now, as the trial is getting closer, beginning to see elite cues from reasonably well-known Republicans that are putting distance between themselves and Paxton. Mm-hmm. Last week it was Rick Perry. The last couple of days, Senator John Cornyn. Mm-hmm. One would very fairly say, well, 1997 called and they want their Republicans back or something.
Yeah.
But it's hard not to feel like that's going to be the leading edge as people begin to feel like they have to commit, as it becomes more salient, as they get asked more about it, as the facts come out and there's more pressure to come down on one side or the other.
Right.
That's something we'll be watching.
Well, and there's one thing that is clear here is, nobody's going to save Ken Paxton if it's going to hurt them.
Right. And I think, we've been saying that, that the balance of people's self-interest and, kind of the rubber's meeting the road right now.
Yep.
Or will as of Tuesday. For sure. So with that, thank you for listening. You can find these new poll results at our website. They'll be plastered all over it at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And also, if you want to get the jump on when and what we're going to release next week, all of our blog posts on that website have a form that you can fill out and get on our mailing list if you're not already on it. It's not a heavy mailing list. Mostly we flag poll relevant news or poll data relevant to news in Texas and signal when we're releasing new data. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, without whom we could not do this. And thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.